Welcome back to day 157 of our 365 days searching the Bible for interesting things. At the moment we're looking at ancient tales or dialogues or parables that humanized the Old Testament law. We're looking particularly at the moment at the books of Ruth, Jonah and Job, and we're making a start today on the book of Jonah. Jonah disobeys God and has to face the consequences. Jonah chapter 1, verses 1 to 17, and chapter 2, verse 10. Once upon a time, Yahweh spoke to Amittai's son Jonah, saying, "Off you go east to that enormous city of Nineveh. I want you to criticize it in public there, because I know exactly how wicked the people there are." Jonah immediately set off west in exactly the opposite direction. He wanted to get as much space between himself and Yahweh as possible. He headed for Joppa and found a ship headed for Spain. He paid his fare and embarked, hoping that Spain would be far enough. Yahweh sent a strong wind as they sailed that was so violent that they were scared the ship might break up. All the sailors were praying desperately, each to their own god. To lighten the load, they jettisoned the cargo. Meanwhile, Jonah was asleep in the hold, where the captain woke him. "What do you think you're doing? Get up and pray to your God. Perhaps your God will have some sympathy for us and spare us." The sailors had an idea. "Let's draw lots and find out whose fault this storm is." Jonah's name was drawn, and they asked him, "We want to know if you are to blame for this storm. What are you doing on board? Where are you from?" "I'm a Hebrew," he replied. "My God is Yahweh, the maker of the heavens, the earth and the sea." And he admitted that he was running away from Yahweh. This scared the sailors so much, and they told him that he had done something dreadful. All this time, the storm was getting worse. So they asked him if he knew what to do to stop it. He said that if they threw him overboard, it would calm down, and he admitted it was all his fault. They refused to do that, and instead did their best to row the ship ashore, pulling with all their might. But the storm got stronger still, and they made no progress against it. So at last they called out to Yahweh, admitted that this storm was from Yahweh, and asked for his pardon for killing Jonah. And then they took Jonah into their hands and threw him into the water. The storm abated immediately, and that scared the sailors so much they immediately offered Yahweh a sacrifice and promised to serve him. Then Yahweh commanded a huge fish to swallow Jonah, and he was in the fish for 3 days and nights. I debated whether or not to interpret the one day at the beginning as once upon a time, and you can see the conclusion I came to. This, like the story of Ruth, is a midrash, a parable. Taking characters and images from various already existing historical literature and folk tales, the writer creates a story to make a serious religious or moral point. In the cases of Ruth and Jonah, the stories went deliberately against the official racist line of Ezra and Nehemiah, which was arguing that only strictly ethnically Jewish adherents to the law of Moses could expect God's favour and protection. So, where did this writer get these ideas from? Well, first, there's the character of Jonah himself. The real, original Jonah only appears once elsewhere in the Old Testament, in one verse in the second book of Kings, chapter 14, verse 25. Jonah, the real Jonah, is a prophet in the northern kingdom of Israel during the reign of the rather successful expansionist king Jeroboam II, who regained much of the territory lost formerly to the northern neighbour Syria. During his reign, the Assyrians were putting Syria under military pressure, which gave Jeroboam his advantage. The writer of Jonah also seems to have known the writings of Jeremiah, who has God saying in Jeremiah 18:8, "If the nation I'm speaking about turns its back on evil, then in return I will change my mind and not bring the evil on it that I had planned." And finally, from Israelite folklore, the writer got the stories of a fish big enough for a human to survive in, and the plant that grows in a day and withers in a day. The writer puts all these elements together and sets the story back in the actual Jonah's day. The purpose of the story was to deny the basic Jewish prejudice after the Babylonian exile that they alone were chosen and precious to God. Jonah in the story is at the beginning and actually all the way through demonstrably in the wrong, refusing as he does initially to preach in godless Nineveh, and clearly should not have been angry with them for repenting and proving him wrong. The message is that in God's providence, large numbers of thoughtful non-Jews would welcome the opportunity to turn their lives around and worship God. This would open the door to non-Jews centuries later in the Jewish diaspora, joining in synagogue worship as God-fearers. And of course, when the Christian breakout from Judea took place, also to Gentiles becoming very quickly the majority of Christians in the early church. Today's reading sets the scene. Jonah is like those leading the Jews home from Babylon. Jonah doesn't believe Gentiles can be saved. Jonah sees God's order as a futile gesture. He thinks God is stuck in the Jerusalem temple. So he heads as fast as possible in the opposite direction away from Nineveh and discovers disconcertingly that God's power is not as limited as he thought. The fish is not punishment. The fish is not punishment but salvation. And for Jonah, it's back to square one, and the story continues tomorrow. I'll see you then.